Hello, commentary fans. Mike is back with his latest commentary. Today we are going to do George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead because it was requested. And I thank you for the request. It's a good film and I really hadn't considered it before. But there's definitely a lot to talk about here. I'm going to start the film in 3, 2, and 1. It's booting up here. We're going straight into it. The curvy Pennsylvania Road. An Image 10 production of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And when I looked at the request, I really hadn't considered doing this before, just because I don't know. I love George Romero and his Dead films, but to be honest, this is the one I've watched the least out of all. Well, that's not true. I haven't watched his newer ones because they're kind of leave a lot to be desired. But this is the one I've watched the least out of it. I watched Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead a lot more than this one, and I think the reason is just that this is really a movie I think that kind of was so groundbreaking that you almost fail to see like you sort of let some of its amateurishness pass by you. And that's not to knock the film, because for what it is, it's an extraordinary accomplishment. This is like low budget indie filmmaking at its all time best. It's a masterpiece of it. But I think, like, in terms of the themes that Romero likes to play with, I think Dawn of the Dead and even Day of the Dead are just, I prefer them over this one. But I think what's interesting about Night of the Living Dead is more of what it means as a kind of a piece in the history of horror films. Like, around this time, this is definitely horror coming into a new era. I mean, you could almost say that horror has had two eras, and you could say that the one that began the last horror era, at least in the United States, was Dracula, and then you could say that Night of the Living Dead began the second era. Just the time that this came out is a really interesting time, not just for horror movies, but just movies in general, because in 1968 we sort of see roughly the end of the old kind of censorship on films. It was the end of the kind of the code, and then you had the MPAA come in with the rating system. And so it allowed for films to take a little bit more risks. Night of the Living Dead isn't an overly gory film, because it really couldn't be. I think it would be a little too much at this point. But it does imply a lot of horrific things that really hadn't been done quite to this extent before. I've kind of lost the beginning of the film. We're seeing Barbara and Johnny coming to an old cemetery outside of Pittsburgh, I believe. Romero is from Pittsburgh, and that's where all his films are, so I assume that this is where this takes place. But they're leaving a little cross at the grave of their father. And here's an example of kind of, you see Romero's writing as not quite as polished, because the exposition leading up into the horror is a little silly, but you know, it does. There's sincerity to it. I'll definitely say, because you'll never forget this beginning because of Russell Steiner here, who's playing Johnny. When he sees the zombie coming, and of course goes on and says, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." You know, that's horror legend right there. I always really like the cemetery setting, and they do it really, really well here. And just like the fact that this is a low budget film and that they actually have to find a real cemetery. I know as they pull in, you see the flags and stuff. And it's really, really creepy. Just kind of that authentic touch, Some people, this is really, like, some people, this is a great fear, and me included, just the whole idea of the cemetery makes me feel really, really uncomfortable. uh, right now we have Bill Hensman kind of scattering around in the back. He's the first zombie of the film who is the one that's coming to get Barbara and attacks poor Johnny for his assholishness. uh, One thing I'll say about this film is that it's kind of cool in that, like, it's not so, I don't know, 46 years now. I mean, that's not so terribly far away from us today. Uh, I've been to a number of horror conventions, and one of the all-time best was Flashback Weekend in 2008, which was the 40th anniversary of the film. I'm sorry, I say Flashback Weekend as if you know it, but it's a really cool Chicago-based horror convention that happens at the end of the summer. If you're listening in the area, I really highly recommend you check out their website. But they put on a really good show every year. And for 2008, it was, of course, the big 40th anniversary of Night of the Living Dead. And so they had pretty much everyone who was still alive at that point. And I got to meet Russell Steiner and George A. Romero, which was really, really a treat. Sort of the highlight of that convention was that they had a panel discussion of Night of the Living Dead. And so everyone was there to, ask questions, and it was really something. They were like treated like rock stars there, and it was really, really cool. And so I actually got to ask Romero a question, and I think and I thought it was an interesting one, but he didn't really have all that great an answer for it. I said, like, looking back, are you glad the movie ended up being shot in black and white? Did it add to kind of the mythos of the movie? And I really think this movie benefits, from being shot in black and white. I don't know, what would you call me, snob, but I don't know, but I like black and white. I think it kind of adds kind of the artistic quality to it, and especially with horror films, it just, I think, makes everything a little more grim. But Romero, when I asked him that, he said there was no way that they could afford to shoot it in color. And, it's an honest enough answer, I suppose, but, I guess it's just a way of someone like me romanticizing the movie more than what's really there. We're entering the farmhouse now. Judith O'Day's Barbara has escaped Bill Hintzman, and Bill Hintzman was a big part of that convention. He probably got the best reaction out of anyone outside of Romero, because he actually appeared in character as the zombie, and he looked like the film. I don't know what's that saying, that he aged well, or that the character was so gruesome and horrifying that you didn't look like he had aged 40 years at all. But he would walk around the convention floor in the powder makeup, and it was just really kind of cool. Fortunately, he passed away 2 years ago, and that's really a shame. But he definitely left his mark on the horror field. Seeing all the taxidermist animals here. One thing I think kind of doesn't get really, well, it sort of does, because it's addressed a little bit, I guess, in the remake of the film, which, I don't know, a lot of people like it and whatever, but is that Barbara here, like, once she kind of leaves the cemetery, she kind of becomes petrified and helpless. And, in terms of kind of like how you look at horror film characters, since Night of the Living Dead is so iconic, a lot of people, I think, use it as an example that horror films kind of have a sexist view of the world, and it's unfortunate, because I don't think they do. But she's definitely not a strong character. But I don't think at all that you can claim that Romero isn't progressive in his thinking at all. Because, zombies are only as interesting as the commentary behind them. And Romero always has something to say with his zombies. Here is the hero Ben, played by Duane Jones, and I probably butchered the pronunciation of his name. I apologize. It's no disrespect to him, but he is the hero Ben, and of course you notice that he's black. A lot of people say that that's one of the groundbreaking things about the film, and he's definitely the best thing about it. He's the best actor in the film, gives the best performance, and he really spearheads the whole action of the film, because Night of the Living Dead has some traps in its writing, and you could tell that they're the traps of having a really low budget film. The entire thing kind of plays like a stage play, in that, they never leave the house. And really, the horror of the story is kind of coming from within, and with the threat of a monster, and not kind of the monster being shoved in your face all the time. And that is a a trait of a really good horror film, in my opinion. Um, you see, the monsters are there, and Romero has to take time to show the outside of the house and remind you of the horror that's out there. But a lot of it, a lot of the film is just kind of strategizing what to do, and the nervous tension of being locked in this house. And so you need really strong performances in the film. And I think Dwayne Jones as Ben here is really brilliant, and he really keeps the momentum up, which I think is crucial in this film. Going back to what I was saying earlier about how horror, this marks a point in the horror genre. It's not only the creation of the zombie film, but it's also kind of the creation of modern horror. And I think one thing we'll notice in horror films that happen after Night of the Living Dead is that were released after Night of the Living Dead is that the horrors kind of don't come from a sophisticated place. I don't know, what would you call it? More lowbrow horrors. Oh gosh, this is terrifying here. The zombies moving across the house. One glaring thing about Night of the Living Dead is that everyone knows that the film has entered the public domain, and it's really a shame that it has in a lot of ways, because public domain films, no matter how good they are, they kind of suffer from the fact that there's no real financial incentive for anyone to release them in a really high quality print. I'd be really hesitant to buy this film on Blu-ray, because I just really can't see anyone who would put the money into going far out and giving it the tender loving care that it really requires. The film went into public domain because of something really, really stupid. The producer filed the copyright under one of the working titles of the film, and I think it was Night of the Ghouls or Night of the Flesh Eaters or something like that, and he didn't file it under Night of the Living Dead, and so there wasn't copyright on the film. And now anyone can sell it, distribute it in any way they want. A copy I'm watching right now is one that I got a long time ago. It's one of the first DVDs I got, actually. I bought it for $5 at a time when a $5 DVD was unheard of. It's from Hollywood Classics, which is really as bad as it sounds. It's got like the PowerPoint DVD menu. Oh man, it's really, really funny. But one thing I will say about it is there's some debate over whether some of this grain and flicker adds character to a film. And in a weird way, I sort of agree with that. I definitely feel that in some cases the movie looks more interesting. Especially, maybe this is really just kind of me putting my own opinions on the film, or like finding stuff that really isn't there. But um, I think like the movie kind of looks kind of like something like a document might see on History Channel or something like that. It looks kind of like the footage you see from the civil rights era at the time, or kind of like messed up, zombified Zapruder film or something like that. But I guess you could look for the positives in anything. Romero really, I think, when you look at how the horror genre has evolved, he's had just about as much an impact as anyone. His zombies are kind of the archetype. They are, when people do zombies, they do them as Romero did them for the most part. There's always the kind of the debate about the 28 Days Later zombies versus the classic Romero ones. And what's interesting is that Romero, Romero, has some mythology to the characters. I like in the later film, Dawn of the Dead, how they explain that they're all on instinct, and of course their instinct is to come to where they've known. Um, you know, Zombies have kind of become very popular again, and it's interesting to think why, because, you know, they haven't really changed all that much, kind of the mechanics of everything. They're still following the Night of the Living Dead kind of scenario of everything. And so you wonder, what is there to be said with zombies? And because, to be honest, zombies aren't really all that interesting on their base level. They're not very frightening. They're lumbersome, and they just kind of hulk around and drool. And so, what's really is there to be afraid of? I'd much rather. I find I like a little eloquence in my monsters, but like you said, it's kind of the politics and metaphors behind zombies. And so you wonder what Romero initially wants to do here. And in Dawn of the Dead, it's very much I think he switches it up over the course of the films, and everyone has their theories. But in Dawn of the Dead, it's pretty blatantly an anti-capitalist message. That consuming flesh is very much like consuming product, and that's how that film goes. And then in Day of the Dead, which I really hardly recommend. I know it gets a lot of flack, but I think it's probably my personal favorite horror film of the 80s, I think. It's really good, and it's got a very anti-military chauvinist slant to it, and then so I think the zombies in that one kind of end up as the heroes because they're innocent, and then sort of like it shows that they're like cattle in the midst of the militaristic butchers, and so Romero portrays them that way. I think in this film, it's very much a product of the 60s, and so you definitely could see that maybe there would be anti Vietnam slant in the same way that maybe Day of the Dead was, that they see human beings as cattle. Or you could even say, go back a little further and have it be a Cold War satire. You know, saying that, like, what's it? Invasion of the Body Snatchers, pardon me, where, just like human beings are just kind of numbers, and they have to conform, and zombies really are a horror story of conformity. That the scariest thing about them is that they're really kind of a dissection about being human and alive, and then you just see that humanity is a lot more than just the flesh. It's really skin deep. The zombies don't have their souls, and that's a frightening thought at all. And there's actually, like you said, there's not really a lot of zombies in this film. It just didn't make practical sense for Romero to have a lot of zombies because he couldn't afford all those group shots. Like now don't quote me as 100% for sure, but I would imagine that pretty much all the zombie shots were probably filmed in a short period of time, and the rest and the majority of the filming was all this interior stuff. And like I said, this is really a outstanding example of a low budget film, because you really like Romero is able to have a broad idea on a microcosm canvas. Later on, we're going to be introduced to Charles Craig, who plays the newscaster, and he's another one I met at the Flashback Weekend convention. But he's really very good in the film. He plays the newscaster who's on the radio and TV, and he's got a great voice that really lends a sense of authority to the film. And one of the things I think he serves is to expand the world of the film, because you see him mentioning that all this is taking place on a much larger scale than what's just happening here. And then so you see that it's not just these characters here, and then you place them in a larger world, and so it's a little more frightening because you see that everything out there is madness. Yeah, they're kind of relaying their stories of what's happened to them up into this point, and kind of how they got where they are. And Judith O'Dea's Barbara is telling all about Johnny and how he got attacked there. And Judith O'Dea, I think, is good, but I think she kind of relishes in sort of the melodramatic nature of the character. And it's not really a complaint about the film. It's just kind of something to notice, in that kind of like how in some of these movies, you really had to challenge unknown actors. But I think the one who doesn't skip a beat and always seems almost always realistic is Duane Jones. Has been here. He always is very, very strong. And just going off of the fact that he's an African American man, like a lot of people view that as one of the reasons that the movie was subversive. You're either turning on the radio and you'll be introduced to Charles Craig's voice. And it was a real treat seeing him at that convention because he read some of this text again and really did. It was like you were in the movie. But going back to Duane Jones, I'm sorry, it's gonna drive me nuts until I find out how to actually pronounce his name. Romero always said that, from what I've read, that he simply casted Duane Jones because he gave the most proficient audition. And, you know, if that's true, good for him because that's really, I mean, good for him that, you know, there wasn't any prejudice involved. I mean, you know, I almost look at this time as like almost nightmarish and kind of how backward the world was and how, you know, groundbreaking was when there's just major changes. But even so, casting him in this film definitely was a kind of a big move because you didn't really see a lot of movies starring black heroes, and you know this was kind of the period of the civil rights horror. I mean, this is the same year Martin Luther King got shot, and so you have to think that this was something of a big deal. I mean, maybe not right away because obviously Romero didn't know that this movie would become the giant success that it did. But really good for him. And, you know, even if it wasn't intentional, I think it definitely changes the way you read the film. Because one of the themes about the Romero zombie films is that you see just kind of how futile all the old prejudices and of the old world are, because you see the zombies have kind of shaken the world upside down where nothing is the same. And so if you had someone in this situation, or you know, just really any sort of natural disaster that presents life or death stakes, you got to wonder that, like, what would you do in that situation? Would you be willing to kind of throw things aside in terms of survival? Like, let's say a racist was in this situation with Duane Jones. Would they be able to, you know, survive on those terms if he offered them survival? And I think that's definitely an interesting aspect about the film and sort of about the character here. And he is, you know, ironically the strongest character, so you'd like to think that maybe audiences at the time maybe got something out of their horror film watching at the time. I mean, that's really kind of cool. I know in the remake, Tony Todd played the character, and he's a good actor too. and so it's definitely he's definitely a strong character. One other thing about horror films at this time is that you definitely notice that um, you definitely notice that a lot of horror films, like from this period, are not being produced by the major studios. They're being produced by independent producers, or kind of like the low budget kind of things, like um, the American film, the Roger Corman types. And you see the Samuel Zaroff pictures with Vincent Price, that they're lower budget and that they're independent. And I think like that's really it was really a great period for horror filmmaking. Especially, even further is George Romero, who completely funded this money with, just raising it himself. And he started off as commercial, who would shoot commercials in Pittsburgh, and he kind of used those resources to channel into his own film. And because of that, he didn't have a studio kind of dictating what he would do, and so the horror film was able to kind of progress forward, and that more risks could be taken. Um, One thing I think Night of the Living Dead kind of spearheaded that idea. That I think it kind of challenged horror films in America. Like it set the floodgates open. I think a great companion piece to Night of the Living Dead, and the one that sort of is the other great granddaddy of the horror film stays, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Tobe Hooper made that film, and one thing you'll notice about both of them is that they're both really restricted by the low budgets, but their ideas are very big, and there's a lot of horrible stuff in those films, but the vast majority of it is implied horror, and they don't overexploit their monsters. They focus on the survival of the characters fighting for survival. And going back to what I was saying earlier, about these films kind of going away from the very kind of sophisticated nature of the really old horror films of Dracula and Frankenstein, or even, the giant monster films. Like, these characters in them aren't scientists or aristocrats, they're ordinary people. And I think that really terrified audiences, because obviously horror hits home when you see that it could happen to you. And, one thing I always think of when I see Night of the Living Dead is kind of the idea that it was probably played on a lot of drive-ins in the rural areas, and I think it's kind of fun that this is like the perfect drive-in area or drive-in film. Right now we're here with Carl Hardman, who's playing Harry Cooper, who was kind of an antagonist in this film, and he really goes with the theme that what good is chauvinism in a situation where life and death are at stake here. He's kind of a ham. He's probably the biggest ham in the entire movie, and he's fun though. Like, and I don't really expect everyone in these low-budget horror films to be great actors. And, Judith O'Dea kind of goes over the top a little bit. And this Carl Hardman goes way over the top. He's like screaming his dialogue. But, what you want is sincerity in a performance. And I think you definitely get a lot of sincerity in this film. And I think that's why it's timeless and why why you don't criticize some of the faults that it has or some of the limitations, because some of the best low budget films kind of have all these faults just because they're kind of handicaps that every low budget film has. They have to find creative ways to do the scope, and they have to sometimes deal with actors who don't necessarily have the same screen presence, but there's definitely a sincerity about Night of the Living Dead, and I think that's important. Here's here's Keith Wayne as Tom, who's just kind of a handsome, pretty boy, and he's pretty good in the film. But as soon as he goes in, then as soon as he goes in that he's walking meat. He was my favorite character the first time I saw this film, just because, I thought he'd be the hero, and I was kind of expecting the movie to kind of go with the stereotype that the black guy would be the first to die. But, good on Romero to go against that stereotype before it was fully invented in earnest. Here we have the scene where the zombies all skulk around. One thing you'll notice about the film, how spooky is that? Reaching from the window and grabbing in. I really wish I could kind of tell you how terrible my print of this movie is. And, like I was saying, it definitely kind of adds something to it, I think. It's really kind of fun. You don't often hear that a bad print of a movie enhances your enjoyment, but that's definitely the case here. Yeah, you see, there's not really a whole lot of gore, although you do see some bullet blood on that zombie there. One one thing about the Romero is that he collaborated with Tom Savini on pretty much all of his films, but this one. And rumor has it that Savini was originally hired for this film to do the makeup, but that he had to leave because he was drafted into the Vietnam War. And that's one kind of cool thing that you'd like to imagine what Savini would do even before. See, here's another kind of troublesome scene here. The whole debate over whether the Coopers are going to stay in the basement versus staying upstairs and being safe, and who's in charge of this house, even though like the owner's not here. But Mr. Cooper wants to take Barbara down, and he wants to take Barbara down to the basement, and that's one of the unfortunate things about the movie is that kind of she sees Barbara as kind of a piece of property almost, and that's like you wish Barbara were a stronger character. I mean, Judy, she's gonna get it too. Keith Wayne, I guess, is one person who never appeared in another film after this one, and I found out that he actually killed himself later in life, and that's really too bad. You know, you always hate to hear that. He's got kind of a good naivete about him. He's sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, like Ron Howard look to him. There we have the first look at their poor little daughter, Karen, played by Kira Shawn. I can't pronounce her name either. Schon is what it is. She's actually the daughter of Mr. Hardman, and she's playing the daughter in the film. And she really, I guess, is very big into the horror scene. I've seen her at a few conventions, and she's always seemed very nice. I've never met her personally, but she's definitely the most frightening character of this film. You know, it's kind of funny seeing everyone take their smoke break in the film. You know, you have to wonder how long this siege would last, what they do without their cigarettes. Oh man, it's just a funny thing about really any film at this time, is kind of seeing how old-fashioned it is and how the story could change over time.
Does anyone up there know why we're being attacked?
Whatever it isn't just happening here. It's some kind of mass murder. It's going on everywhere. The radio said to stay inside.
Radio?
Radio upstairs. I heard a news bulletin.
There's a radio upstairs and you boarded a thing down here?
I know what I'm doing.
What did it say?
Nothing. Nothing. They don't know anything.
Oh, this is interesting. You see the wife here fighting for her husband and kind of getting rid of his kind of masculine, kind of hurting his pride here.
People for us to tell us what to do.
Yeah, he's
We may not
definitely
enjoy living
gets his
together,
pride wounded.
but dying together isn't going to solve anything. Those people aren't our enemies.
One of the things you notice about Night of the Living Dead is that
If Judy would come downstairs
the
for a
film
few minutes, Harry and I could come upstairs.
doesn't like, you go into it and you know pretty much everything about the whole zombie mythos. Even if you've never seen one of these films in your entire life, just kind of like through the grapevine of pop culture, how the mechanics of a zombie movie work. And this movie has to explain it for the very first time. And you see poor Karen here, who's been bitten by the zombie, and she's nothing but a walking time bomb who's going to attack and hurt everyone here. And so you on the one hand, someone seeing for this movie for the first time, it must have been truly, truly frightening. But I think the film still can scare you in that way, and that you expect it to happen, but you just don't know when it will, and so it's so scary. Yeah, we have see Judith O'Day there. She's kind of petting the couch, and really her character is kind of just dumbed down. See, you know what? Maybe I was a little hard on her. She seems to do a decent enough job here. I mean, like, what Romero is asking her to do is kind of regress in the shock, and it's to do that conceivably, and to to do that in a way that has that impact. It's challenging, but you do feel for. You definitely have a compassion for character Barbara there. Yeah. All their shattered nerves. Treating them with cigarettes. One of the things you see Cooper mention again that there's could be 50 million of them. And one of those things I wonder is, how well this movie would work if you didn't even show the zombies at all. Could be really either scary or, it could be bad. I don't know. But I think that's interesting. Here we have the TV finally coming into the equation, and there's Charles Craig again as the newscaster. Finally, you're getting some conception of what's going on. Well, this is a really classic scene. It might be my favorite in the whole movie. Just kind of like, I think, kind of the old-timey feel of it, and it's really kind of frightening too. Just the idea of the actual television going away, you know. That's one of the things that they play with in the later films too. Dawn of the Dead has the main characters are newscasters, and later on in the film, when the biker gang invades the mall, you see one of the bikers try to steal a TV, and he goes, "Oh, what are you gonna watch? There's nothing." And one of the things that goes on, you know, later is that probably the TV broadcast would just disappear entirely, and there'd be nothing but static. And I guess that's one of the things about our culture, even now it's worse than it was then, is that the TV is kind of your lifeline, and you need it right away. I like this, you know, so they're showing the rescue stations and where you need to go. But it's interesting, you know, here we have the reports about the president, and obviously Romero doesn't have the ability to have an actor play the president, you know, kind of give it the grandiose quality we need. And so he, you know, makes it huge, but makes it huge and yet, like, brings it down. There's like we just missed it, it's the only reference to sort of explain what goes on here. He's mentioning a satellite that got lost in orbit, and the radiation of it might be responsible for bringing the dead back to life. You know, it's never really all that important to the whole zombie legend, how it happens or why it happens. You know, in some movies they spend a lot of time trying to find out why it happens. There's a good subplot in later film, Day of the Dead, where there's a group of scientists in the military bunker, and their whole job is kind of discover why it happens and to study the zombies. But really, you know, why it happens is kind of inconsequential to the fact that what needs to be done is survive. And you sort of see traces of almost oh geez, what was I going to say, almost Katrina here, you know, that Romero goes into the bureaucrats, and you know, they don't have any conception of what to do, despite their consistent efforts to appear in charge of everything and to show that they have, you know, the ability to answer all the questions and to be strong. And, you know, that's a situation like this kind of dumbfounds it. Judy had a radio. They went up to go swimming. Oh man, they're kind of typical teenagers from this time. They're like almost out of a sitcom. You'd almost expect them. Yeah, I really like these scenes on the radio. They just kind of add everything a little gravity. This Charles Craigie reminds you of almost an Edward R. Murrow. He does a good job there. Here we find out that one of the things bit her. I don't really know if they discuss how that biting transfer the zombies in this film. It's been a while since I saw this. But I like the fact in this film that the dead come back to life on their own, that everybody comes back. You know, some of the later zombie films, they kind of cheat the logic a little bit and have the zombies not come back. But just being dead, you have to actually get the disease. Here they're actually talking about the fact that you can't have funeral arrangements, that you have to take the body out and burn them immediately. Dubious comforts of a funeral service. That's kind of fun and interesting. You know, I don't know, I hate funerals. You know, it just kind of shows you that life and death, you know, they kind of go into that, you know, that what really life is, and then, you know, the body isn't the soul. And, you know, maybe that's a little deep, but I definitely sort of get that from the zombie picture. You know, you see that a dead body is really nothing but a hunk of meat at its base level. Here they're starting to devise a plan to get out there. And, you know, aside from this scene, the rest of it, or when they're about to try to gas up the truck and escape, like the rest of this movie really just takes place in his house. And it's just kind of like, you know, with one film, they really, or, you know, with one scene in a low budget film, they really try to stretch out the confines of everything by having one extravagant scene. And you think that this scene here where they tried to escape, I think is really it. Yeah, see, there's the other thing that we all take for granted. The phone, like, imagine what would happen if all the cell phones went out, you know? That'd be only add to the hysteria being out of contact with everything. Rescue stations. Yeah. Here we have Romero kind of putting in a little dramatic moment between Judy and Tom, and, you know, you sort of see the limitations of the dialogue here. You're trying to have a dramatic moment, you know, that these two are obviously a couple. And you get more of the feeling that between, or you get, it feels more authentic between Cooper and his wife, just because they seem a little older and, like, you know, this kind of feels really inauthentic, their relationship. And I think the reason why is, I don't know if it's because Romero was young or just because, in a lot of horror movies, these love, or these scenes, well, not love scenes, obviously not sex scenes, but these scenes where these two characters kind of express their fears and how they love each other, don't want to see each other go. They kind of are hard to write, I think, because I think the challenge of them is that just kind of the whole absurdity of the whole thing. You know, you really need an actor who is really capable of doing the full gamut of emotions, and they're very kind of casually afraid, and that's what can plague a film like this. And I think you'll notice later in the film that I think the mother, Mother Cooper, and her daughter Karen, that there's a bond between them. And just because you see Karen is very, just the idea of a kid being in this situation really lends itself, I think, really well. Romero was wise to do that, because I think if you had like Judy as the one who was sick, it just wouldn't be, I don't think, as frightening, because it's because you see a kid and you're almost more scared, because obviously, innocence. I'm kind of getting into this scene. Yeah, it's definitely, like I was saying, big moment of the film, kind of the pyrotechnics of it. They're trying to scare him with fire. I wonder, ooh, they even one caught on fire there. That's kind of freaky. You wonder how they could do that on kind of a low budget. But it worked okay. Of course, nothing goes according to plan. Yeah, we're having the old classic debate on if you can outrun a zombie. Can they catch up to you? And that's the catch-22. That's pretty frightening thing about them, is that, one of them probably isn't going to get you. It's going to be a whole bunch. And the scenes in this that are the scariest are, you see them all crowding around when there's hundreds of them. Romero shoots these scenes pretty well, because obviously I can't think that he had more than probably 25 extras at the most. He probably had just his friends and family as the zombies. But they really do a good job of framing the scenes really well. Like, everything with the zombies is very claustrophobic. You see them in very close angles, and that smothering feeling is terrifying. Land of the Dead, on the documentary for that, they talk about kind of the motivation he gave to the zombie characters, and what they do. And I remember an interview with John Leguizamo, who was kind of the villain in that film. He went on Conan O'Brien promoting it, and he kind of talked about the characterization, and you obviously want a little bit of the character themselves, the character that they were before they became zombies. But, it's just kind of on a strict, rigid path. I think, I think you do need characterization to a zombie. Otherwise, you're right, they just kind of become real boring. Yeah, that's the money shot of the movie, the car exploding. Their last hope slowly burning away. Yeah, I like the fact it's different that there's not a lot of makeup on these zombies. Like, I can't imagine it was anything more than powder. And so, you're right. This probably was the film with the best, quote unquote, zombie acting because, kind of the horror had to be more from the actors themselves than you having good old Tom Savini go all out with a zombie makeup job, make them all green and gooey. I like the scene later on. I don't know if we've seen it yet where the zombies gorge on the flesh, but I'm positive that it must be nothing but chicken bones that they're eating there. There you see Cooper being the giant coward that he is, refusing to help. Yeah, every good zombie film has that moment where the survivors band together and, it's the one who looks out for himself the most usually ends up losing. And, maybe that's not how things work in real life because obviously if you're in a situation you do want to look out for yourself. But you want everyone to be a good team player, especially when you have the one who's the expense are the likable characters of Barbara and Ben. You don't want to see anything happening to them. I wonder if we actually get to see them as zombies. They have to be, Ken, or, Judy, and the other one is zombies. I think you do. I forget, I can't really tell because, oh yeah. Yeah. This might be the scene I was thinking about earlier. Oh, yep, where they're eating the flesh. Ooh. Yeah, this is a little bit more gory than I remember it being that. Those might be intestines. But that's just raw meat, really. Yeah, this is a moment, again, where the black and white really adds to the film. Because it definitely seems kind of like a historical artifact. But I swear, I am pretty positive that one of the things there was KFC chicken. At least that's what I always thought and kind of like to wish it would be. It was the first moment in the film, besides from the beginning where it kind of had a soundtrack, and it was kind of effective there, kind of the beating there. The pulsating sounds there. Yeah. Here's where they kind of get the epiphany that they're going to have to work together if they're going to survive. But I think the moment that's most interesting in a zombie movie is kind of the part where they lose hope. And it's gonna come up here soon. Oh, Barbara. She's finally contributing to the film. Yeah, here more of the zombies are sort of fighting over the last remnants of everything. Yeah. You know, looking back on this is another movie where you wonder what the audiences must have thought about it at the time. It must have been pretty terrible, you know, just the implications of it. And though the gore effects really aren't all that impressive to someone like this. You think what someone must have thought, and just the implication of all this must have been horrifying. And just once this came out, everything, I guess, was free reign. Here we have the rednecks coming out and shooting the zombies in the head, which is the kind of the most popular aspect of the zombie legend, and it's one that Romero invented. Well, you almost think, if they're dead, what kind of impulse is triggered by the head. But, I have to think that in some way there's some sort of gratification that, fantasization, or fantasy, not fantasization, that's a made up word, some fantasy, that people want to see here. There's shows like Walking Dead, which I haven't seen, but I know it's very popular, or video games like Resident Evil or House of the Dead, where the entire point of it is, the endless onslaught of zombies and just shooting at them. And it's certainly a popular part of legend. And you have to think that, maybe there's sort of a bloodlust kind of aspect of the zombie film. And I don't necessarily mean that in kind of a way that, that the people want to commit violence who like zombie movies. I just think that it's part of the fun of the story, that you want to see the characters kind of go out there and, hack through the zombies. I don't know. It's a fun part of the story for sure. And, even later on, it becomes a bigger part in the sequels, the militarization. Having the military go up against them in Day of the Dead. There's some almost moments where they kind of become action films. Probably the biggest is Land of the Dead, which is kind of the fourth sequel to this. And In that film, they even have a whole weapon called Dead Reckoning, which shoots out missiles and stuff. But you almost wonder. Oh, there's a big moment where they finally learn to use tools, and they're trying to bust through the doors. I don't know if that's the zombie that we saw earlier. Oh man, how scary is this to be in this situation, you know, feeling so helpless here, you know. And then you see Cooper has no spine to him whatsoever. That's the character you want to see get it, painful death. And it's always sort of satisfying when you set up a character like that. Yeah, all Cooper cares about is proving himself right about the cellar. That's one thing about these zombie films, is that, you know, they lock themselves up in an area to survive, but just kind of cabin fever of everything, you know, drives them to fight each other when they should be combining their forces to fight the zombies. And that's it just shows you, kind of like what I was saying earlier, what happens when society, or when you're cut away from society and you try to apply your old prejudices to the world. You know, they don't really have any effect anymore. And what you need to do is you need to think in a different way and open up that survival instinct. Yeah, Cooper got his just desserts. There's some nice use of shadows here. There's Bill Huntsman again coming out through the windows. But yeah, there's some nice use of shadows here. You see like the panels hide up there. And Barbara finally coming off of the couch. Oh, here is the most frightening moment of the film, where Karen comes to life as the zombie. Well, not comes to life, obviously. Oh, she's grabbing the trough there. That's really one of the, you know, distills of her slowly coming up with the trough. That's really one of the most iconic scenes in horror. And you know, Romero is gutsy, really gutsy to have this done by a child to her mother. And this is kind of the most gory scene in the movie, because you actually do see some blood there. And you wonder maybe that's kind of a benefit to being black and white. Because I know some of the Hammer films had a lot of trouble getting things past the censors because of the gore in them. And, you know, getting the right ratings, because, you know, they really did get explicit, but in black and white, you know, all you do is chocolate syrup, and it's, you know, it's a little more theatrical and a little less realistic. Yeah, here's the moment when everything hits the fan, and poor Ben is left alone. Um, there's, you wonder why, you look at these movies and you sort of see, you sort of want there to be a happy ending, but, Romero, you wonder if Romero's films, I don't think, for his commentary and what he wants to say, they almost don't work if they have a happy ending. I know that this film has a really iconic ending where we see poor Ben get his brains blown out because the rednecks don't realize that he's not a zombie, and it just kind of goes with the themes of the film, kind of showing later on how kind of like you're unrecognized. I mean, like human life is unrecognizable in the midst of all this brutality. There's some more insults. Here we have Mr. Cooper come up, and he doesn't have his arm. Yeah, he does a good job, old Carl, as a zombie there. That blank, expressionless stare. I really like the ending to Dawn of the Dead a little bit more, because it has the same effect as the ending to this film, but like there's a little bit of hope left. You get the sense that maybe they could do it, but it's bleak in the same way. In this film, it's depressing, to tell you the truth. But, the movie's about the zombies, and it's more effective, I think, if they win, because you show how kind of futile everything is. And always the biggest zombie shots are saved for the very end of the film, because you see the most of them, and they're all cramped together. Duane Jones died in 1988, coincidentally the 20th anniversary of the film. And I guess he never, I think I read that he claimed he never saw the film more than once, and he was kind of burned out with it, and he just didn't like the fact that he was only recognizable in this Pope role. But yeah, it's an impact. It's definitely a role that has an impact, and this ending really kind of, punctuates it in a way too, because you do kind of really want to see him live through all this, and just kind of seeing this horrible fate that waits him. Really, just in the aftermath of kind of what happened to Martin Luther King and stuff, and seeing this, this great hero kind of looked off as a nothing, and it's kind of scary, or not necessarily scary, but it makes you feel, I don't know, empty, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, going off also on the fact you just see these rednecks plow through the zombie. There's definitely kind of a bloodlust to it, and you almost, I don't know if you feel sorry for them, but you do sort of feel sorry for them in the way that you hit the head right between the eyes. Yeah, you know, you feel sorry for them because they're kind of like animals, you know, and the fact that they're just so casuously and cavalierly killed kind of makes you wonder who's the real bad guys in the story. You know, and if everyone's doing this to them, and if the whole world is kind of deserves this, and that's what Romero really does well. You know, when society is kind of goofy, you gotta subject it to flesh-eating cannibals from beyond the grave. Here we have the end credits, and they're pulling out poor Ben's body to add to the fire. And boy, they really, really rub it in now, don't they? But I hope you guys enjoyed this commentary. It was kind of a challenge, I have to be honest, because, you know, it's just looking at a different era of horror, and I think it's a really good film. I think what I like about it, actually, maybe a little bit more than the film itself, is kind of it as a historical piece in the history of this great genre, that you see that it represented a definite place and time, and it began the modern horror genre. And there are the zombies burning away, and we will see you again. Have a good evening and enjoy. Isn't an overly gory film, because it really couldn't be. I think it would be a little too much at this point. But it does imply a lot of horrific things that really hadn't been done quite to this extent before. I've kind of lost the beginning of the film. We're seeing Barbara and Johnny coming to an old cemetery outside of Pittsburgh, I believe. Romero is from Pittsburgh, and that's where all his films are, so I assume that this is where this takes place. But they're leaving a little cross at the grave of their father. And here's an example of kind of, you see Romero's writing as not quite as polished, because the exposition leading up into the horror is a little silly, but you know, it does, there's sincerity to it, I'll definitely say, because you'll never forget this beginning because of Russell Steiner here, who's playing Johnny. When he sees the zombie coming, and of course goes on and says, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." You know, that's horror legend right there. I always really like the cemetery setting, and they do it really, really well here. And you know, just like the fact that this is a low-budget film, and that they actually have to find a real cemetery. I know as they pull in, you see the flags and stuff, and this is like low-budget indie filmmaking at its all-time best. It's a masterpiece of it. But I think, like, in terms of the themes that Romero likes to play with, I think Dawn of the Dead and even Day of the Dead are just, I prefer them over this one. But I think what's interesting about Night of the Living Dead is more of what it means as a kind of a piece in the history of horror films. Like around this time, this is definitely horror coming into a new era. I mean, you could almost say that horror has had two eras, and you could say that the one that began the last horror era, at least in the United States, was Dracula, and then you could say that Night of the Living Dead began the second era. Just the time that this came out is a really interesting time, not just for horror movies, but just movies in general, because in 1968 we sort of see roughly the end of the old kind of censorship on films. It was the end of the kind of the code, and then you had the MPAA come in with the rating system. And so it allowed for films to take a little bit more risks. Night of the Living Dead got to meet Russell Steiner and George A. Romero, which was really, really a treat. Sort of the highlight of that convention was that they had a panel discussion of Night of the Living Dead. And so everyone was there to, ask questions, and it was really something. They were like treated like rock stars there, and it was really, really cool. And so I actually got to ask Romero a question, and I think and I thought it was an interesting one, but he didn't really have all that great an answer for it. I said, like, looking back, are you glad the movie ended up being shot in black and white? Did it add to kind of the mythos of the movie? And I really think this movie benefits, from being shot in black and white. I don't know, what would you call me, snob, but I don't know, but I like black and white. I think it kind of adds kind of the artistic quality to it, and especially with horror films, it just, I think, makes everything a little more grim. But Romero, when I asked him that, he said there was no way that they could afford to shoot it in color. And, it's an honest enough answer, I suppose, but, I guess it's just a way of someone like me romanticizing the movie more than what's really there. We're entering the farmhouse now. Judith O'Day's Barbara has escaped Bill Hinsman. Hello, commentary fans. Mike is back with his latest commentary. Today we are going to do George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead because it was requested. And I thank you for the request. It's a good film, and I really hadn't considered it before. But there's definitely a lot to talk about here. I'm going to start the film in 3, 2, and 1. It's booting up here. We're going straight into it. The curvy Pennsylvania road. An Image 10 production of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And when I looked at the request, I really hadn't considered doing this before, just because, I don't know, I love George Romero and his Dead films, but to be honest, this is the one I've watched the least out of all. Well, that's not true. I haven't watched his newer ones because they're kind of leave a lot to be desired. But this is the one I've watched the least out of it. I watched Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead a lot more than this one, and I think the reason is just that this is really a movie. I think that kind of was so groundbreaking that you almost fail to see like you sort of let some of its amateurishness pass by you. And that's not to knock the film, because for what it is, it's an extraordinary accomplishment. Really, really creepy. Just kind of that authentic touch, you know. Some people, this is really, like, some people this is a great fear, and me included, just the whole idea of a cemetery makes me feel really, really uncomfortable. Right now we have Bill Hensman kind of scattering around in the back. He's the first zombie of the film who is the one that's coming to get Barbara and attacks poor Johnny for his assholishness. uh, One thing I'll say about this film is that it's kind of cool in that, you know, like, it's not so, I don't know, 46 years now. I mean, that's not so terribly far away from us today. I've been to a number of horror conventions, and one of the all-time best was Flashback Weekend in 2008, which was the 40th anniversary of the film. I'm sorry, I say Flashback Weekend as if you know it, but it's a really cool Chicago-based horror convention that happens at the end of the summer. If you're listening in the area, I really highly recommend you check out their website. But they put on a really good show every year. And for 2008, it was, of course, the big 40th anniversary of Night of the Living Dead. And so they had pretty much everyone who was still alive at that point. And I